Ever heard of a group called the Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments of God?
Yeah, the MRTCG.
Yeah, them. It's a pretty fascinating and tragic story.
Yeah, it's one of those cases that kind of sticks with you.
Definitely. And that's what we're going to unpack today. You've got some really interesting sources for us.
Yeah, we've got a scholarly article, a couple of Wikipedia articles just for background, and a couple of news articles from around the time.
So we're talking about a Ugandan religious group met a really mysterious end back in 2000.
Right, and I think it's important to say right up front, this is heavy stuff. We're talking about a real tragedy.
Absolutely. We'll definitely approach it with the sensitivity and respect it deserves.
For sure. Okay, so for anyone who isn't familiar with the MRTCG, let's set the scene. Can you give us a picture of Uganda in the late 1980s?
Sure. So imagine like a nation reeling from Idi Amin's dictatorship. Then on top of that, you got the AIDS epidemic hitting really hard. And civil war. It was a lot.
That sounds like chaos.
It really was. And that's the world the MRTCG grew from.
So it makes sense that people were kind of looking for something, anything, to give them hope.
Exactly. And that's where these two figures come in. Credonia Mwerinde and Joseph Kibweteere.
This is where it gets interesting.
Right. So they claim to have these visions of the Virgin Mary, which at the time was, believe it or not that uncommon in that specific part of Uganda.
Really? Why was that? Was there something about that region that made these kinds of, visions more common? I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but there was definitely this, deep belief in the possibility of divine intervention, especially through the Virgin Mary. It's like people were desperate for some kind of guidance in all the suffering they were going through.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you've got all this turmoil, people are looking for answers, and then boom, Mwerinde and Kibweteere show up claiming these visions, and they start the MRTCG.
Yeah.
But they didn't just stop at spreading the word, did they?
Oh, no. This was about way more than just spreading a message.
Yeah, they came up with this whole belief system, a really strict code of conduct. What were some of the things that made the MRTCG so different, even extreme?
Well, I mean, the name kind of gives it away.
Right.
The Ten Commandments were everything to them.
Okay, sure, but plenty of religious groups focus on the Ten Commandments. What made the MRTCG different?
They took it to, the next level. Imagine being so afraid of breaking the commandment about lying that you're almost completely silent all the time.
Wow. Seriously?
Yeah, there are stories of them, relying on sign language just to avoid accidentally saying something untrue.
That's intense. It makes you wonder, did it create this kind of pressure cooker environment in the group, Yeah. Everyone's walking on eggshells all the time.
Yeah, it probably wasn't the most relaxed atmosphere. But, you also have to remember, for a lot of people, the MRTCG wasn't just about rules, it was a sanctuary. These strict beliefs gave them a sense of order in a world that felt really chaotic.
Right. It was about more than the rules themselves. It was about what those rules represented.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about speech either. Their beliefs touched every part of their lives. Strict fasting, specific clothing, hard physical labor, everything was about being spiritually pure, getting ready for the end of the world, which they believed was coming really, really soon.
So they're preparing for this apocalypse, right? But they also saw themselves as restoring true faith. Where did they stand with the Catholic Church? Did they see themselves as part of it or something separate?
That's a good question. It was this weird mix of tradition and rejection. They called it, and this is a mouthful, selective traditionalism. Basically, they kept some Catholic traditions, especially anything to do with the Virgin Mary, but they totally rejected what they thought was the modern church, straying from, the true faith.
So they cherry-picked what they wanted. And how did the church feel about that?
Well, they weren't thrilled. They saw the MRTCG as suspicious, even condemned them outright. And that's really important to understand because it fueled their whole apocalyptic worldview.
Yeah.
Now they felt even more like they were the chosen ones being persecuted for their belief.
Like they were creating their own narrative, their own justification for their beliefs.
Absolutely. And this tension with the church, it just added more fuel to the fire, no pun intended. But that's a story for later.
Yeah, I was about to say, feels like we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this group. They're living on the edge, preparing for the end, and now they're on bad terms with the church. Feels like we're building towards a breaking point here.
We are, and that breaking point, it all centers around the year 2000, or at least that's what everyone thought at first.
Okay, so before we get to the year 2000, there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to talk about. Their book, A Timely Message from Heaven.
Right, their sacred text. That book was everything to them. It laid out their whole belief system, all their apocalyptic prophecies, and this promise of a new earth. for the chosen few after everything ended.
So what exactly did this timely message say about the year 2000? What were they bracing for? The book, its title alone, A Timely Message from Heaven, The End of the Present Time.
Right.
It suggests, like, an immediacy, like this is happening now. Did it actually give specific dates for this apocalypse?
It did mention dates, yeah.
Okay.
But figuring out what those dates actually meant, that's been a whole thing. A lot of people believe, and this is what you usually hear about the MRTCG, that they said the world was going to end on December 31st, 1999.
Oh, wow. The whole millennium thing. That makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
That date must have been, like, unbelievably intense for those people.
Oh, absolutely. Can you imagine all your beliefs, everything you've built your life around leading up to this one day?
And then nothing happens.
Right. And when January 1st rolled around and the world was still there, it caused a lot of, well, unease is putting it mildly.
Yeah, I can imagine. So what happened to the group? Did they just fall apart? Did everyone lose faith?
Not exactly. Some might have started having second thoughts, but a lot of them, they actually doubled down.
Really?
Yeah, they clung even tighter to what the leaders were saying. The leaders, they started reinterpreting things, saying the apocalypse wasn't wrong, it was just delayed.
Okay, so no, December 31st, 1999. But they still thought the world was ending sometime soon.
Right. And there's actually stuff in A Timely Message, little hints that suggest the actual date was always meant to be a bit more flexible.
Flexible?
Yeah, like they were pointing towards some other time in 2000.
Okay, so not the new year, but sometime later in 2000.
Yeah.
This is where it gets really, really dark.
It is. Because on March 17th, 2000, tragedy struck.
This is the day of the fire, right?
Yeah. The fire that everyone thought at first was a mass suicide.
Right. But like you said before, it's way more complicated than that.
It is. Because the fire, as awful as it was, it's only part of the story. What started as this tragic but seemingly straightforward event, a group driven to suicide by their beliefs, it became clear pretty quickly that something much, much bigger had happened.
And you're talking about the mass graves, right?
Exactly.
Hundreds of bodies.
Hundreds. Buried in these mass graves, right there at the MRTCG's compound in Kanungu.
But here's the thing, right? We talked about this a little before, but the investigators, they realized that those people in the graves, they hadn't died in the fire.
Right. They were already decomposing. These people had been dead for weeks, some of them maybe even months, before that fire ever happened.
So this wasn't just some suicide pact gone wrong.
No.
This was something else entirely. This was planned.
Yeah. You look at those graves, the way they were laid out, it was organized. Someone or a group of someone's had been systematically killing these people for a long time.
It's horrifying.
It is. And it changed everything. Suddenly, it wasn't a mass suicide. It was a mass murder investigation.
And that fire, March 17th, 2000, it was almost like the final punctuation mark on this horrible, horrible sentence.
Yeah. It's chilling when you think about it like that.
So who did it?
Yeah.
Who orchestrated all of this? And why? Why spread it out like that? And how do you go from this group that's so focused on, spiritual purity and finding salvation to something that's capable of this? It's like, we can't just say, oh, they were misled or they misinterpreted something. This goes way beyond that.
It does. To understand March 17th, you have to look at the really dark side of belief, the pull of these charismatic leaders, and the fact that people, even with good intentions, are capable of awful things.
Okay, so we've got the fire at the graves, but what actually happened on that day in those final moments at Kanungu? How did these people die?
Well, like a lot of things with this case, we don't know for sure how everyone died. The fire itself definitely killed a lot of people.
Yeah.
But the investigation showed that a lot of them, they died from something else.
So it wasn't just the fire itself. What else did they find? What caused all those deaths?
Well, the official investigations, they said poisoning was a big factor.
Poisoning.
Yeah, like maybe they put something in the food or the drinks. It's awful to think about.
That's cold. Planned out like that.
Right. And there were signs of other stuff too, like strangulation, some blunt force trauma.
Wait, really?
Yeah. It makes it hard to believe that this was a group that was, trying to get to heaven. It just doesn't add up.
It's just pure brutality.
It is. And that's the thing about this whole case. Trying to square what they said they believed with what actually happened at Kanungu, it's almost impossible.
We talked a little bit before about those other theories, like that maybe this was all part of some rapture scenario. Like they thought if they drank the poison or whatever, that they'd be taken up to heaven.
Yeah, some people think it wasn't murder at all, that it was a suicide pact and they all went along with it willingly. It's hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. And then there's that theory from Richard Vokes about the bodies in the pits maybe being from a malaria outbreak years before. Does that change things?
It definitely makes things even more complicated. If he's right, then we're talking about two separate tragedies here, although I guess they'd still be connected in a way, because if those really were malaria deaths, it just shows you the bigger problems in that society. You know, people couldn't get basic medical care, which probably made the MRTCG even more appealing in the first place.
It's like a puzzle where you can't figure out which pieces go where.
Exactly.
So many questions. What about the leaders? Did they die in the fire too?
We don't know. Some people say they planned the whole thing and got away before the fire started.
Wow.
Others think they died with everyone else. We just don't have enough evidence to know for sure.
It's the kind of story that, gets in your head and just stays with you.
Yeah.
You know, it makes you wonder what makes people do these things.
It really does. I think it forces us to look at some really uncomfortable things about human nature, like how powerful belief can be, how easy it is to just follow a charismatic leader, even when they're wrong.
And how important it is to think for yourself.
Exactly. The MRTCG, it's this awful reminder that you always have to question things. You can't just accept something as true because someone tells you it is. You have to think for yourself.
It's a lot to take in. This whole thing that happened in Uganda, it's awful on so many levels. And even though we might never get all the answers, I think the questions themselves are really important. You know?
Yeah, I agree. Trying to understand what happened, it might help us keep something like this from happening again.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like, by looking into the darkness, maybe we can find some way to bring in a little light.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a tough one, but really eye-opening. Thanks for bringing this story to us and walking us through it.
Of course.
And everyone listening, we hope you found this deep dive thought-provoking, even if it was tough to hear. Remember, it's okay to ask hard questions. It's okay to challenge what you think you know. In fact, is more important than ever. Thanks for listening.